I called that dinner because I thought it was time. Time to make peace with the years behind me. Time to put my affairs in order while I still had a clear head and a steady hand. I wanted it to be a warm evening, something graceful, something that would remind my family that love still lived quietly between us. But from the moment she walked in, something felt off. Her smile came too quickly, her voice too sweet, her hands a little too eager to serve. She moved around that table like a hostess, not a guest, refilling my glass before I even touched it, pulling out my chair as though she had rehearsed the gesture. I told myself I was imagining it, that maybe she was just trying to be kind, but the air around her carried a hum I couldn't ignore. Then, as laughter filled the room, a young waitress leaned in close and whispered 4 words that froze the world around me. "Do not drink that." My fingers tightened around the stem of the glass, and for a heartbeat, I forgot how to breathe. I smiled, thanked her softly, and waited for the right moment. When it came, I simply reached forward, switched our glasses, and looked across the table at that perfect, shining smile. It was still there. Only now, it belonged to someone who didn't yet know her plans were about to end. Thank you for watching, my dear ones. It means more than you know. Before I continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always love to know where hearts are listening from tonight. My name is Marjorie, and I live in a quiet corner of Maryland, a place where the evenings are calm, the air smells faintly of pine, and the nights stretch softly over old memories. I've lived here for over 40 years, in the same house my husband and I built when life still felt wide open and promising. It's the kind of home that carries the weight of every laugh and every tear. The kind of place where even the floorboards seem to remember our footsteps. After he passed, the house grew quieter, and I learned how to fill silence with small things. Watering the garden at dawn, setting the table for one, listening to the clock tick through the still hours. I raised my son, Daniel, mostly on my own after my husband died. He was a good boy, bright and tender in his own way, but life changed him over the years. Maybe that's just what happens when people grow older, and comfort replaces gratitude. He met Claire, the woman who would become his wife, and I tried to welcome her with open arms. She was graceful, beautiful, and clever with words, the kind of woman who knew how to make every room turn toward her. At first, I thought that was a gift. I mistook charm for kindness, and I let her laughter convince me that family could be easy again. But slowly, things began to shift. The warmth in her eyes cooled whenever no one else was watching. My advice became an irritation. My presence, a formality. Still, I stayed gentle. I believed patience could fix almost anything. When the years started weighing heavier on my shoulders and my body began to whisper that it was slowing down, I decided it was time to take care of what I could still control. I wanted no confusion, no fights after I was gone. I've seen too many families crumble over money and land, over things that were meant to bind them together. So I called a family dinner, hoping for peace and fairness. I didn't tell anyone what I planned to announce. I wanted it to be a surprise, a gift, not a negotiation. But something about the days leading up to that dinner unsettled me. Claire called more often, asked about my health, my medication, whether I'd been feeling tired. She started sending over meals, fussing over my comfort, and while her tone was soft, her eyes when she visited spoke something colder. I told myself to ignore the unease, that I was being dramatic, that she was only showing concern. But when I saw her that night at the restaurant, dressed elegantly, every hair in place, glowing with anticipation, I realized she wasn't just attending a dinner. She was waiting for something. She had a plan I hadn't been invited to see. Still, I smiled, because I've learned that sometimes the best defense isn't anger, it's patience. That's what my husband used to say. Patience reveals the truth faster than any confrontation ever could. And that night, I would find out just how right he had been. The day of that dinner started like any other, yet something in the air felt heavier than usual, almost like the world was trying to whisper a warning I couldn't quite hear. I spent the morning polishing the silver earrings my husband gave me on our 25th anniversary, the ones shaped like tiny leaves. I wore them whenever I needed strength, a quiet reminder that I had already survived so much worse than disappointment. As I got dressed, I looked at myself in the mirror and thought about how quickly time moves, how one day you're chasing your son around the yard and the next you're signing papers about who gets what when you're gone. I wanted that evening to be graceful, to be remembered as a moment of closure and love, not suspicion or greed. By late afternoon, the sky turned golden, the kind of light that makes everything feel nostalgic. I sat by the window, waiting for Daniel to pick me up, and my mind wandered to all the years behind us. I remembered his laughter as a child, the nights we sat together reading, the way he used to look at me for approval before every big decision. But somewhere along the road, my guidance began to feel like a burden to him, something that reminded him of humility when he wanted pride. When he met Claire, that distance grew wider. She wrapped her influence around him like a ribbon, soft at first, then tightening slowly over time. I saw it, but I said nothing. Love, after all, can make a mother quiet in the face of what she fears might drive her son further away. When they arrived to pick me up, I noticed how they looked together. She was radiant, like someone walking toward a finish line, her smile steady and practiced. He looked proud, maybe even relieved, like a man certain his family was finally in perfect harmony. On the drive to the restaurant, she talked endlessly about renovations, vacations, all the plans she and Daniel had for the future. Every sentence began with "we," as if there was no room left for anyone else in their world. I nodded, listened, smiled when appropriate, but deep down, a chill ran through me. Something about her tone didn't sound like excitement. It sounded like ownership. When we pulled into the restaurant, the valet greeted us kindly, and I remember thinking how beautiful the night felt on the surface, how easy it is for danger to hide beneath beauty. The moment we stepped inside, I felt everyone's eyes turn toward us. The restaurant was softly lit, tables set with crisp white cloths and polished glasses that shimmered under candlelight. Claire had chosen the place herself, and I could see why. It wasn't cozy, it was performative, elegant in a way that demanded attention. She wanted a setting that reflected her, not me. She guided me to the head of the table like a hostess welcoming a guest, her hand brushing my shoulder in that gentle, staged way she did whenever people were watching. Daniel seemed relaxed, maybe even happy to see us all together again. He asked about my health, my appetite, if I'd been taking my vitamins, and for a moment, my heart softened. I wanted to believe he still saw me as his mother, and not a piece of property waiting to be divided. But then, Claire leaned in and filled my glass again, insisting I try the wine she'd specially chosen. Her eyes lingered on me a second too long. I smiled, thanked her, and raised my glass slightly as if in silent approval. But deep inside, something shifted. That unease I'd been trying to ignore all week suddenly grew roots. It wasn't my imagination. Something was wrong. And before the night was over, I was going to find out exactly what it was. The waiter had just taken our orders, and the hum of quiet laughter floated around the room like a soft tune. For a moment, everything appeared perfect, almost peaceful. But beneath that calm, I could feel tension curling through the air like smoke. Claire sat across from me, her posture flawless, her hands folded neatly beside her plate, her smile never leaving her lips. Every now and then, her eyes flickered toward my glass, watching it the way a cat watches a door that's about to open. I pretended not to notice, speaking about ordinary things, my garden, the neighbors, the weather, yet my words felt as though they were floating in water, muffled and slow, because my thoughts were racing elsewhere. I could sense her excitement, that strange, greedy light hiding behind her eyes, and it chilled me more than I wanted to admit. When the food arrived, she reached over with a laugh, saying she'd cut my steak for me, something she had never offered before. I thanked her, but I kept my hands still, my face calm. Every move she made seemed rehearsed, too careful, too considerate, as if she was performing kindness rather than feeling it. Then she raised her own glass, clinked it lightly against mine, and whispered, "To family and good health." The words slipped from her tongue so easily, but the way she said them made me uneasy. I lifted my glass, smiling politely, though my fingers hesitated around the stem. Just then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the young waitress approaching, her steps quick but quiet. She leaned close, pretending to tidy the table, and slipped a small folded napkin beside my hand. I didn't look at her, just unfolded it under the table, my heart thudding softly against my ribs. 4 words stared back at me. Do not drink that. The room felt smaller in that instant. My throat dry, my breath shallow, but I managed to smile, steady and polite, as if nothing had changed. I waited for her to turn away, and when she did, I calmly reached forward, switched our glasses, and lifted mine toward the light as if admiring the wine. Claire's eyes sparkled as she mirrored me. I smiled back, and in that moment, I knew this evening was not about inheritance or good health. It was about survival. And for once, I was ready. For a few moments after that switch, I kept my face perfectly still, breathing through the tightness in my chest, pretending that nothing had happened. The candles flickered, the silver caught the light, and laughter floated from another table nearby. Everything looked ordinary, yet inside me, every sense had sharpened. I could hear the faint clink of Claire's bracelet as she lifted her glass, the soft catch in her throat before she took that first sip, the way her smile stayed fixed even as her eyes darted toward me. I didn't drink. I only watched. I smiled when Daniel told a story from his work, nodded at his jokes, and folded my napkin carefully each time I set it down. My heart thudded slowly, deliberately, because I wanted her to believe I was calm, oblivious, and exactly where she wanted me. Minutes passed, slow and heavy. Claire kept sipping, her laughter growing louder, forced, the way people sound when they're waiting for something to happen and trying to hide it. Then it began. A small tremor in her hand, a faint sheen of sweat on her forehead. She blinked too often, reached for the water glass, and laughed again, but this time her voice cracked at the edges. I tilted my head just slightly, pretending to show concern, and asked if she was all right. She brushed it off, said it was just the heat of the room, but her eyes were already losing that sharp, confident gleam. I turned my gaze to Daniel, who was busy cutting his food, unaware that the world around him was about to tilt. The room felt colder somehow, though no one else seemed to notice. Claire reached for her napkin, missed, and tried again, her fingers trembling now. I set down my fork quietly, folded my hands in my lap, and watched as her composure began to slip away like a mask, melting in slow motion. A few more seconds passed before her laughter stopped completely. Her face drained of color, her pupils widened, and her breath came shallow. I leaned forward gently and said, "Claire, dear, you don't look well." She tried to respond, but the words stumbled out of her mouth as half sounds, half air. Her chair scraped backward, the glass tipped, and red wine spilled across the white tablecloth like a spreading bruise. Daniel jumped to his feet, confused, calling her name, his voice rising with each second. The restaurant quieted, conversations fading as people turned to look. I stayed seated, calm and silent, my pulse steady now. I already knew what was happening. I didn't need to say a word. She looked at me for a brief moment, her eyes wide and terrified, and in that instant, I saw the truth written across her face. Whatever she had planned for me had turned on her, and there was no stopping it now. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate, glanced at the untouched glass that had once been mine, and whispered only to myself, "Sometimes evil forgets who it's sitting beside." The restaurant went silent after she fell, the kind of silence that rings louder than any noise. Daniel was shouting her name, shaking her shoulder, his voice trembling between panic and disbelief. I stayed seated, hands folded neatly in my lap, my eyes steady on the wine glass that sat in front of me. Around us, people began to whisper. Some stood, others pulled out their phones, and somewhere near the bar, I heard someone calling for an ambulance. The smell of spilled wine filled the air, sharp and bitter, and for a long moment, no one seemed to know what to do. Claire gasped, clutching at her throat, her skin pale and damp. She tried to speak, but the words dissolved into choked breaths. I watched the life drain from her confidence, watched the woman who always controlled every moment lose her grip on this one. Daniel turned to me, confused, his eyes wild with questions I couldn't yet answer. "Mother, what's happening? What did she drink?" His voice cracked on the last word. I told him calmly to stay beside her, to wait for the medics, that everything would be all right. My tone was steady, almost too steady, because inside, my heart was breaking for the son who didn't yet understand what had just unfolded. A waitress hurried over with a towel, hands trembling as she dabbed at the wine. I looked at her, the same young woman who had slipped me that folded warning. Our eyes met for just a second, and in that look, I found both terror and courage. She knew. And I knew she had saved me. The medics arrived quickly, their voices brisk and low, the sound of their equipment cutting through the heavy quiet. They lifted Claire onto a stretcher, still semi-conscious but fading. I caught Daniel's hand as he passed me, and I told him softly to go with her, to stay calm, that we would speak later. He nodded, dazed, then followed them out the door, his footsteps echoing in the marble corridor. The door closed behind them, leaving only the faint scent of perfume and spilled wine. I sat alone for a moment, staring at the chair she had been in, the imprint of her on that cushion still fresh, and I thought about how close I had come to being the one taken away instead. I thanked the waitress quietly when she came to clear the table, my voice almost a whisper. She shook her head, said she couldn't ignore what she saw, said she overheard my daughter-in-law in the restroom on the phone with someone, talking about making it look natural. I felt my stomach twist at those words, but I kept my composure. There was no point in anger now. Only truth, and truth was already beginning to rise like smoke from a fire that couldn't be hidden anymore. As I gathered my bag and stood to leave, I glanced at the glass she had used, half empty and glinting under the candlelight. I didn't feel victory, only a strange, quiet sorrow that love had turned into this. I walked out into the night air, and it was cold, sharp, and honest, just like the truth that was finally on its way to the surface. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room with the lamp on low, the house wrapped in silence except for the faint ticking of the clock above the fireplace. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that moment again. The glass, the whisper, the look on her face when she realized something was terribly wrong. I wanted to feel anger, but what I felt instead was disbelief. How had it come to this? How could someone I had welcomed into my family, trusted with my son's happiness, and treated with nothing but kindness, plot to take everything from me? I ran my fingers along the edge of the armrest, trying to calm the shaking in my hands. I kept thinking about Daniel, wondering what he was feeling now that the mask had fallen from the woman he thought he knew. I prayed that when the truth reached him, it wouldn't destroy the part of him that still believed in good. By morning, the phone rang. It was the police. They wanted me to come down to the station to give a statement. I dressed slowly, choosing my gray coat and a scarf my husband once bought me during a trip to Boston, a piece of warmth for a day that felt cold from the inside out. At the station, the air smelled faintly of coffee and paper, and the officers spoke in quiet, measured tones. They asked what I remembered, and I told them everything. The dinner, the invitation, the way she had hovered around my glass, and the note that had stopped me from taking that final sip. They nodded, took notes, and asked to speak with the waitress. When she arrived, her hands were trembling, but her voice was steady. She told them she overheard Claire in the restroom speaking to someone on the phone, saying I wouldn't make it through the evening, that it would all look like a medical episode. Her words fell heavy in the room, and I felt the last pieces of denial crumble away. After I gave my statement, I walked out of the station and into the sharp morning light. Everything looked different, brighter but lonelier. I went home and sat by the window again, watching the bare trees bend in the wind. Hours later, Daniel called. His voice was quiet, broken. He said she was in the hospital, recovering but under watch, and that the toxicology report showed something in her system, a substance meant to mimic a stroke. It was supposed to leave me confused, fragile, and incapable of making decisions. They wanted to declare me unfit, to gain control of my estate. Hearing it confirmed didn't bring relief. It only deepened the ache inside me. I stayed silent for a long moment, then told him gently that I wasn't angry at him, only sorry he had to learn what love looks like when it's poisoned by greed. That evening, I called my lawyer, a kind man named Mr. Hendricks, who had been handling my affairs for years. I told him everything that had happened, and he listened quietly before saying, "Marjorie, it's time we make your will reflect what you've learned." His words were calm, but they carried weight. I agreed. There was no revenge in my decision, only the need for truth and protection. By nightfall, the documents were ready to be signed, waiting for my hand in the morning. I stood by the window, watching the lights in the distance fade into darkness, and whispered to myself, Sometimes you don't need to fight to win. You just need to survive long enough for the truth to reveal itself. The next morning came heavy and gray, the kind of morning that feels as though the world is holding its breath. I brewed a cup of tea, though I hardly touched it, and sat at the table where the sunlight fell through the curtains in thin, fragile lines. My lawyer arrived right on time, a folder tucked under his arm, his face calm but serious. He laid the papers in front of me, each one a reminder that life can change in a single evening. I picked up the pen slowly, feeling the weight of what I was about to do. My hands trembled just a little, but not from fear. Only from the gravity of knowing this was my chance to take back control, to protect everything I had worked for from falling into the wrong hands. I signed each page carefully, steadying myself with each stroke, hearing my husband's voice in the back of my mind saying, "Do what's right, Marjorie, not what's easy." When it was done, I set the pen down and felt a calmness move through me, the kind that comes after a long storm. Later that afternoon, Daniel came by. He looked exhausted, his eyes red, his voice quiet. He sat across from me and took a long breath before speaking. "They found messages on her phone," he said, his words barely above a whisper. "She planned everything. She even had someone waiting outside the restaurant in case she needed help, making it look like you were ill." His voice cracked halfway through, and I saw the boy he once was, sitting there behind the man he'd become, scared, lost, and ashamed. I reached across the table, placed my hand on his, and told him softly, "It's not your fault. When people hide their hearts behind charm, it's hard to see the truth until it's too late." He nodded, tears filling his eyes. And for the first time in a long while, I felt his hand hold mine the way it used to when he was small. That moment didn't erase the pain, but it built a bridge where silence had been for years. He told me the police would be pressing charges, that the investigation was moving fast, and that Claire would have to face what she'd done. I listened quietly, my gaze fixed on the window where rain had begun to fall, each drop tracing its way down the glass like time itself refusing to stand still. I didn't gloat, didn't celebrate, because there's no joy in betrayal, only lessons carved into the soul. I told him I hoped she'd get the help she needed, that one day he'd find peace beyond this, and that sometimes justice doesn't need to shout, it only needs to be seen. He wiped his face with the back of his hand and whispered, "I don't deserve you, Mom." I smiled faintly and told him, "You do, because you came back when it mattered most." As he left, he turned at the door, his face wet from both rain and regret. I watched him walk down the path, shoulders slumped, and felt a strange mix of pain and gratitude. Pain for the years I'd lost trying to earn affection that should have come freely, and gratitude that the truth had chosen to reveal itself before it was too late. When the house grew quiet again, I looked around and felt the stillness settle in like an old friend. I wasn't alone, not really. I still had my strength, my clarity, and the peace that comes from knowing I had survived deceit with grace, and that to me was worth more than any inheritance could ever be. The following morning, I felt an unusual stillness in the house, the kind that only comes after chaos. The air carried that faint scent of rain from the night before, and the world outside my window looked washed clean, though my heart still felt heavy. I made myself breakfast, but barely touched it, the clinking of the spoon against the bowl sounding far too loud in the quiet. I had done what I needed to do, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like closing a door I never wanted to open in the first place. I had spent most of my life building bridges for people I loved, and now I was learning how to live after one had been burned by someone I called family. Later that day, I went to see my lawyer again. He had already been in touch with the authorities and confirmed that the investigation had taken a decisive turn. Claire had admitted to purchasing the substance, claiming she only meant to weaken me for a few days so Daniel could take charge of the finances. Her words were cruel in their simplicity, as if the plan hadn't been meant to break my body, but only my dignity. It stung more deeply than I expected because dignity was all I had left to protect. My lawyer told me the evidence was overwhelming. The text messages, the bottle found in her car, and the recording from the restaurant security camera showing her hand brushing the rim of my glass. Justice was already working quietly in my favor, though it didn't bring comfort, only clarity. When I returned home, the phone rang again. It was Daniel. His voice was weak, softer than I'd ever heard it. He said he couldn't sleep, that every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face at that dinner table. He kept saying he should have noticed, that he should have protected me. I told him the truth. Some people hide their intentions so well that love becomes blind to warning signs. I reminded him that what mattered now was not guilt, but growth. Learn from this, I said gently, and promise yourself never to let kindness be mistaken for weakness again. There was a long pause on the line, the kind that carries both sorrow and understanding, before he whispered, "I promise." That evening, I sat by the window again, holding my cup of tea close, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. The sky faded into deep blue, and I thought about the young waitress who had saved my life with 4 quiet words. Her bravery had given me the chance to stand where I was now, breathing, thinking, and reclaiming what was mine. I decided right then that her kindness wouldn't go unnoticed. The world could use more people who act without expecting anything in return. I made a note to call the restaurant the next day, not just to thank her properly, but to make sure her courage was remembered in the way she deserved. As the clock ticked toward midnight, I realized something had shifted inside me. The fear that had lived in my chest for days was gone, replaced by a steady calm. I had walked through betrayal, through deceit, and through danger, and I had come out the other side not as a victim but as a witness to what truth can do when it refuses to stay buried. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and whispered a prayer. Not for revenge, but for peace. For myself, for my son, and even for the woman who had tried to destroy me. Because sometimes forgiveness isn't about freeing them. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of what they did. The next day, the sun rose brighter than it had in weeks, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't wake up with fear pressing against my chest. The world outside looked ordinary again, but nothing inside me felt the same. I moved through my morning quietly, watering my plants, folding a few clothes, and letting the stillness of the house remind me that peace doesn't always arrive with noise. It often walks in softly after the storm has passed. I spent the early afternoon meeting with my lawyer one final time to finalize the new version of my will. Each page I signed felt lighter than the one before, like I was peeling away the last layer of something heavy that had clung to me for far too long. By the time I finished, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. My estate was now protected, not by walls of trust, but by truth. Later that evening, Daniel called again. His voice was steadier this time, but I could still hear the weight in it. He told me the police had finished their report, that the evidence was undeniable, and that Claire would be facing charges for attempted fraud and endangerment. I could hear the heartbreak in his silence, that quiet guilt that comes when someone realizes love had been a disguise all along. I listened, not to his words, but to the pauses between them, and when he finally asked if I could forgive her, I said softly that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing not to let the pain define the rest of your days. I told him that what happened didn't have to shape who he became, that every ending carries a lesson, and this one had already taught me the importance of listening to my instincts. He thanked me, and before hanging up, he said he wanted to visit soon, just the two of us. His voice cracked on that last line, and I knew he meant it. After the call, I sat by the window again, the same spot where I had watched the world unravel days before. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in gold and deep orange. I thought about how fragile life is, how a single choice, a whispered warning, a small act of courage, can change the course of everything. I found myself thinking of the waitress again, of her steady voice and the quiet bravery it took to step into danger for a stranger. I decided right then that I would do something for her. Not out of obligation, but out of gratitude. Some people enter our lives for only a moment, yet their actions echo far beyond it. I wanted her to know that she hadn't just saved a life that night. She had reminded me that good still exists, even in the darkest corners of the world. That night, I made myself a simple dinner and ate slowly, letting the quiet fill the space where worry used to live. I wasn't afraid anymore. The truth had come out, justice was finding its way, and the house felt warm again, alive with a kind of peace that only comes after surviving something meant to break you. I looked around the room, at the photographs on the mantel, at my husband's face smiling back at me from a frame, and I whispered, I kept my promise. I stayed strong. The words felt like a prayer, not of sorrow, but of release. I knew then that the worst had passed, and that whatever came next, I would face it with the same calm strength that had carried me through that night of deceit. A few days later, I found myself standing in the same restaurant where everything had happened, but this time the air felt different. The tables were half empty, the music softer, and the world seemed to move slower, as if it too remembered that night. I had come to meet the young waitress who had saved me. When she spotted me, her face lit up with surprise, and she hurried over, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. I smiled and told her to sit, that I wasn't here to make her uncomfortable, only to thank her properly. She hesitated for a moment, then pulled out a chair and sat across from me, her eyes filled with warmth and a little disbelief. I reached into my bag, took out a small envelope, and slid it across the table. Inside was a handwritten note and a check. I told her it was for her education, or whatever future she wanted to build. Her eyes widened, tears gathering before she could speak, and I said softly, You didn't just save my life, you saved my faith in people. That's worth more than anything I could ever give. We sat there for a while, talking about simple things. She told me her name was Emily, that she was studying nursing, and that she worked late shifts to pay for her classes. She said she had almost ignored what she heard that night, thinking it wasn't her place, but something inside told her she couldn't stay silent. Listening to her speak, I felt something in my chest loosen. It's strange how a stranger's courage can heal wounds left by those you once called family. Before leaving, she hugged me, and I could feel her trembling, overwhelmed and grateful. I told her that kindness never goes unnoticed, even if the world sometimes pretends it does. Then I left, carrying her sincerity with me like a light in my pocket. When I returned home, the house no longer felt like a reminder of pain, but a sanctuary of lessons. I sat at my dining table, the same spot where I once felt betrayal pressing down like a shadow, and I began writing letters to the people who mattered most. I wrote to Daniel, reminding him that life gives second chances to those brave enough to face the truth. I wrote one to myself too, a quiet promise that I would never again silence my intuition for the sake of peace. I even wrote a letter to Claire, though I didn't know if she would ever read it. I told her that what she did would never define her completely, that we all fall to the darkness we feed, but redemption begins the moment we stop pretending. That night, as the wind brushed against the windows, I realized that forgiveness isn't a single act. It's a slow unfolding. It's choosing to stop carrying the poison left in your heart by others. It's waking up each morning and deciding that what tried to destroy you will not become the story that defines you. I looked around my quiet home, every corner touched by memories of joy and sorrow, and I felt a deep stillness settle inside me. I had survived deceit, faced betrayal, and walked out stronger than I went in. And those scars remain, they no longer hurt, they simply remind me of the truth I lived through. The following weeks moved slowly, but gently, like the world was giving me time to breathe again. Each morning, I'd open the curtains and let the sunlight spill across the floor, feeling it warm my hands as I stood there quietly, grateful just to see another day begin without fear. Life began to find its rhythm again. I returned to the small things that once brought me peace. Watering my roses, baking on Sundays, and walking to the park where my husband and I used to sit for hours watching the seasons change. The familiar sounds of birds and distant laughter began to replace the echo of that night, and little by little, my heart learned to settle. I had been through something terrible, yes, but I was still standing, still breathing, still capable of finding beauty where pain had tried to take root. One afternoon, Daniel came to visit, and when he walked through the door, I could tell that something inside him had shifted. He looked older somehow, not in years, but in understanding. He hugged me longer than usual, holding on like someone trying to rebuild something fragile. We sat together in the living room, the late light spilling through the lace curtains, and for the first time in years, there was no tension between us, only honesty. He told me he had started therapy, that he needed to untangle the guilt and grief that had been living inside him. I listened, quietly proud, because it takes courage to face your own mistakes. Then he said something that made my eyes sting with tears. He said, "Mom, I finally see what strength really looks like. It's not loud or angry, it's calm, it's you." We talked for hours that day, not about what happened, but about what could still happen. About healing, about starting over, about keeping love alive, even after it's been tested by betrayal. Before he left, he promised to visit more often. Not out of obligation, but because he wanted to. When the door closed behind him, I sat for a moment, smiling through the ache of relief, knowing that something once broken had quietly begun to mend. A few days later, I returned to my lawyer's office to finalize a small amendment to my will. There was one last addition I wanted to make: a scholarship fund in Emily's name for nursing students who show extraordinary courage under pressure. I told my lawyer that sometimes heroes wear aprons instead of uniforms, and their bravery deserves to be remembered. When I signed that final document, I felt peace settle deep in my bones. Everything that once felt uncertain was now clear and steady. That night, as I sat by the fireplace with a cup of tea in my hands, I let myself think about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the fear, the truth, and the grace that followed. I realized that surviving isn't just about making it through the storm. It's about choosing who you become after it. I had chosen peace, not bitterness, strength, not vengeance. And in doing so, I had found something greater than justice. I had found freedom. I looked up at the old family photos on the mantle and whispered softly, "It's over now." The words didn't feel sad. They felt like release, like a door quietly closing behind me while another one opened somewhere ahead. As the days turned into weeks, life began to settle into a quiet peace I hadn't felt in years. The air felt lighter, and so did my heart. I spent more time outside, tending to my garden, watching the roses bloom again, the same ones my husband planted so long ago. Every morning I'd sit with my cup of tea, listening to the world wake up, grateful that I was still here to see it. I often thought back to that night, not with anger, but with a strange kind of acceptance. It taught me something no book or sermon ever could. That sometimes the people we love most can hurt us the deepest, but that pain doesn't have to define who we are. We get to choose how the story ends. Daniel visited often after that, helping around the house, talking more, smiling more. I could see a gentleness returning to him, the same one he had when he was little. And I knew that healing had finally begun. The silence between us had turned into understanding. And that, to me, was worth more than any apology. I didn't need grand gestures or promises. I just needed truth, and I finally had it. At night, when the stars came out and the house grew still, I would whisper a prayer of thanks for the second chances life had given me. I had faced betrayal, but I had also found courage, kindness, and peace. The scars would remain.